President Trump's shock announcement of withdrawing US troops from Syria and possibly even from Afghanistan has, in a sense, stirred the pot in both countries. It's not clear if he consulted his chief advisors on this, but I have with me Mr. Arun Singh. He was India's ambassador in the US not very long ago. Mr. Singh, what is your sense of this announcement? It seems very sudden, and was it thought through?
Well, at one level, it is certainly very sudden. It's also clearly against the advice that President Trump had got from many of his national security people. The very fact that US Defense Secretary Mattis eventually chose to resign with this trigger is an indication that the national security people, including people like Defense Secretary James Mattis, were not quite in agreement with this decision. But at the same time, it must be said that President Trump has been saying for a long time, uh, challenging the need for continued US presence, be it in Syria, be it in Afghanistan, and arguing that there is no need for the US to expend more blood and treasure in those conflicts. And of course, the national security establishment in the US advised to the contrary. So President Trump has been pushing for this. And I think once the midterm elections were over, the compulsion on him not to stay with his campaign promise was removed. And clearly, he's looking at his base. And with all the decisions that he has taken, which has been criticized by a lot of people in the US, and many in the national security community in the US are opposed, his base remains with him. He continues to have 40% support, essentially, with his core support base. And they are very happy with this decision. So certainly, this is a decision which will have consequences. Clearly, some of those who are aligned with the US, such as Saudi Arabia and Israel, may be uncomfortable with this decision. Some of those who had fought with the US troops on the ground, such as the Kurds, they may come into a difficult situation. But others, such as Russia, Syria, Iran, would find that this decision helps them in their effort to stabilize the situation there. So we have to see how it plays out.
On the ground, what do you expect in the next, say, a week or 10 days or even a month? Do you expect the Turks to kind of start moving into Kurdish areas? Do you expect some kind of a new conflict to erupt in that area?
So there are many moving parts. One important element is being taken away, which is the US presence, which was supporting some of its sort of forces that were working with US forces on the ground. Now we have to see, because the Turkey may want to use this opportunity to deal with the challenges it faces with the Kurds. Again, it will depend on the extent to which it can work out some broad understanding with Kurds in Syria, so long as it does not affect the Kurdish issue within Turkey. Then you have the question of Syria. The Syrian government will want to see that whatever happens with the Kurds does not embolden the Islamic State within Syria, because at the moment the Islamic State in retreat, but a lot of people say that they continue to have some presence on the ground in different pockets. Now, are they sort of emboldened, energized as a result of this? So we have to see that. And again, there may be some struggle playing out between Russia and Iran for influence in Syria, because Russia would want the present government in Syria to strengthen itself, to become stronger, to be able to exercise its sovereignty. Iran would want to perhaps influence the Syrian government, and through the Syrian government also preserve its assets in Lebanon, particularly Hezbollah. So we have to see how these different interests and strands play out. But clearly, it has introduced a new element of uncertainty in the picture there.
Let's talk about the Islamic State. We have heard very little about that group, although we understand from various reports that there are around 15,000 odd of its fighters still hold up in some part of the desert. Baghdadi remains at large. So, are we kind of, has Trump, in a sense, opened the door again for the Islamic State to rise?
I think Trump is looking at issues from his own perspective and his political perspective. And he feels that US forces should not be involved in fighting outside, and that bringing them back helps him with his core base. So that is primary motivation. Now, what happens on the ground, so long as it does not immediately threaten US interests, I think he's prepared to live with that. So it's possible that elements aligned with Islamic State may gain as a result of this. But then we have to see that as they try to make that attempt, how is that challenged by Iran, by Syria, by Russia, even Turkey? So our picture is a bit uncertain, but clearly the kind of pressure that the US was putting on them, that would ease.
Which brings me to my second point, Iran. Trump has been pushing for sanctions. We're going to see major sanctions come into effect in the next couple of months. Uh, is he again, letting the door open for Iran and some other area? I mean, by doing
I don't
this?
think his intention is to let the door open to Iran, because from all the policies that you've seen, be it how he has been supportive of Israel in the context of Iran, supportive of Saudi Arabia in the context of Iran, I don't think he has any intention of easing on the pressure on Iran. And the sanctions that were imposed, he has walked out of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran on the nuclear deal. So, and next, after a few months, more sanctions would come into effect. So he's not easing on that. So his primary motivation is to move US forces out of there for his own political reasons. Now, if Iran makes some collateral gain as a result, well, then that's a collateral gain that Trump is not paying attention to, because as you've seen from some of the comments that have come, Israel is very concerned with the US decision in Syria, because this introduces an element of instability on Israel's borders. And it feels that it may enhance Iran's presence in the area bordering Israel and also supporting Hezbollah, which will be a security challenge to Israel.
So, in that sense, do you see general weakening under Trump of the US ties with Israel? And how does the security establishment in the US see this?
I don't think Trump would want to weaken US ties with Israel. He has spoken out publicly, very, very supportive of Israel. He has taken some decisions, like the decision to shift the US embassy to Jerusalem, which is again something very supportive of Israel. On the Israel-Palestine issue, he's been very, very supportive of Israel, to the extent that now the Palestinians refuse to talk to the United States. So, by and large, he's been supportive of Israel. And there have been supporters of Israel in the United States who had supported President Trump during his campaign. So, which is also an important factor. But I think, as President Trump has shown by his actions repeatedly, his primary motivation always is his own preference and his own political requirements. And so he first takes an action based on that. There's some collateral damage, collateral gains. Well, from his point of view, so be it. So in this instance, he's done what he feels his base in the United States wants, and where he's maintaining his popularity despite everything, despite all the criticism that has been levied against President Trump. And to that extent, if there is some challenge to Israel on this issue, he can argue that he's done so many things that have been supportive of Israel.
And Afghanistan, do you expect a similar scenario?
Well, people have been sort of worried and wondering for a long time as to whether President Trump would one fine day take a sudden decision to pull out from Afghanistan, because he has repeatedly taken decisions which have been seen as sudden, which have gone against the advice of the security establishment in the United States and within the US government. And on Afghanistan, as you'd have seen, immediately following the announcement of Syria, they have announced that they would draw down forces by 50% and pull out 7,000 troops. So clearly it is a signal that he's moving in the direction of removing US forces from the ground in Afghanistan. Now, you would recall that even President Obama was not very comfortable with continued US presence in Afghanistan and continued fighting effort. And ideally, he would have liked to pull out US forces. He was not able to do it for three broad reasons. First, the US military was opposed to it. Second, there was a worry that if after he withdrew, there was a major terrorist attack emanating from Afghanistan targeting the United States, then it would be a major political challenge for him. So he couldn't take that risk. And third, he couldn't afford for the US to be seen as having been defeated and withdrawn, because then there would be consequences. Extremist movements all over the world would be empowered as a result of that, because they would have argued that earlier they drove out the Soviet Union, now they've driven out the United States. President Trump doesn't quite play by the same political compulsions. So he has shown that he is in a position to take risky, extreme decisions and manage it politically. And therefore, since his preferred option is to pull out troops, he seems to be pushing things in that direction. Of course, at the same time, the US, through his special representative, Zalmay Khalilzad, is holding talks, including with the Taliban, other countries that are bordering Afghanistan, to see if some kind of reconciliation is possible. And ideally, the US would like to show reconciliation, because if they can show that they are withdrawing in the framework of reconciliation, then they would not be seen as having been defeated and withdrawn. If something happens a few months later, 6 months later down the line, then of course others are to be blamed and not the United States. But I think the signal at this stage by withdrawing would probably add to instability and insecurity in Afghanistan.
And how would India be looking at this in the context
I'm
of
sure it
Afghanistan?
will cause concern to people in India, because the important thing is whether the Afghan government and its institutions and security institutions endure. Because the Taliban would clearly be emboldened. You'd recall that when President Obama, for example, in December 2009, had announced that he was increasing US troop level in Afghanistan, he had also then given a timeline by which they must be drawn down.
Yeah.
And many had argued that this was a negative signal, because then the Taliban would say that all they need to do is wait it out, and then they would become ascendant again. And so this troop withdrawal by 50% at this stage could be interpreted by the Taliban and others opposing the US in Afghanistan, or opposing the Afghan government there, that the US is moving and therefore they can harden their positions in the negotiations. And it can certainly create a problem. And therefore, if the US, despite pulling down drawing down its troops, continues to support the Afghan government in various ways, including economic, military assistance, and enables them to endure, then it's a different story. But if they don't do that, then the consequences are unforeseen. Because again, President Najibullah, way back in 1992, eventually was pushed out when the Soviet assistance to him collapsed, because the Soviet Union collapsed. So we have to see that even as the US withdraws, what kind of assistance is it prepared to provide the Afghan government to enable security and other institutions to endure? And if it is not able to do that, then clearly we are headed to uncertain times.
A word on Defense Secretary Mattis. It's been, in a sense, he was the last man standing, really, and today he's left. Clearly, he was no longer in sync with Trump anymore.
For a long time, reports had been coming that there are differences between Secretary of Defense Mattis and the President, and eventually the heading towards a parting of ways. And if you saw the letter of resignation that Secretary Mattis sent to the US President after it was announced, it clearly indicates that the views are not aligned. And he said that it's better that Defense Secretary works with you, who is more in line with your views. And from contents of his letter and other comments that have come, it is clear that he was not comfortable with the way, from his point of view and the Ministry of Defense point of view, the US was, President Trump was articulating policies on NATO, US allies, the manner in which he had approached negotiations with North Korea, the fact that he had sent US troops to the southern border to deal with the issue of immigration, which is normally a police issue, not an army issue. And then setting up a space command, a new space command, which the Ministry of Defense was not comfortable with. So there have been a whole host of issues, including on how President Trump has been approaching Afghanistan, where Secretary Mattis has not quite been in agreement with the US President. But I think this decision to withdraw troops from Syria, contrary to the advice that he and others had given, was perhaps the trigger, or as they say, the straw that finally broke the camel's back. And using that, he's decided to resign at this stage.
Last question, sir. India and the US had this 2+2 dialogue not very long ago. We've seen the departure of one more man, one part of that 2+2. Does this anyway change equations here?
Well, yes and no. Yes, because Secretary Mattis was very supportive of India. And at a time when the present administration was in quite a bit of flux, because the former US Secretary of State Tillerson had for a long time not focused on India, but then had been very supportive of India. Before he visited India in October, he had given a speech in October 2017 at the CSIS, a think tank in the US in Washington, D.C., where he had been very supportive of India. But Secretary Mattis was seen as the person who was, in a sense, running with the India file, as they say in the US, and pushing projects for cooperation with India, pushing the India relationship in the strategic framework. So we have to see now as to how the new Defense Secretary defines or assesses the relationship with India and the manner in which he would like to take it forward with the new US Secretary of State Pompeo. So to that extent, it remains to be tested. But I would say the no in terms of no major change, because eventually institutions matter. And I think for the India relationship, broadly at the institutional level, there is bipartisan support. So in the Congress, there is support, and defense, state, all of them tend to support the growing relationship with India. So institutional support will be there, but the leadership certainly brings an additional dimension to the manner in which new decisions can be taken, new directions given, and that will depend on the priorities that the new Secretary of Defense sets.
So clearly we're in for interesting times. Ambassador Arun Singh, thank you so much.
Thank you.